Good morning, thank you for joining us today. My name is Hannah Booth and I'm the Communications Manager here at MorePay. It's my pleasure to introduce the topic to you for this session, which is employment law changes and important dates in 2022. As 2021 draws to a close and Christmas and New Year celebrations begin, it's always natural to reflect on the last 12 months and perhaps more importantly, start to question what 2022 will bring. Admittedly, in the world of HR over the last 18 months, some of the employment law changes that were previously anticipated have been delayed due to the pandemic. However, 2022 will see legislative development start to progress further. And during this webinar, we'll give you a summary of changes in legislation to look out for in 2022. So in terms of a few practicalities for the webinar this morning, how to ask a question. You'll notice that the microphones have been muted for this session. We do want to hear from you, especially for the live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please do drop your questions into the question panel. We've got nearly 1,300 people registered for the webinar this morning, so I imagine we will have lots of questions, but our expert Linda will do her best to answer as many as she can at the end of the session. Another note, if you're facing technical difficulties, don't worry too much. We will be sending you all a recording. However, if you are facing technical difficulties, please do flag it in the question panel, because if lots of them come flooding through, I'll know this is an issue at our end and I can do my best to try and fix it. So moving on to the agenda for this morning, we'll start off with an overview of the recent government consultation on flexible working. Linda will then run through carers leave, the gender pay gap reporting deadlines, and the new professional qualifications bill. She'll then update you on the new health and social care levy and also the national minimum wage rates. Finally, Linda will also delve into compulsory COVID vaccinations, and we'll also take a quick look at the best way to keep up with employment law changes before moving into the Q&A session. Now, before I hand over to Linda, I'm conscious that we will have people on the webinar this morning that aren't necessarily familiar with MorePay, so I'll give a very brief introduction. MorePay provide payroll software and HR software, as well as managed payroll and HR services, and we do this for more than 10,000 customers across the UK. If you have any questions about our offering, please do drop some questions into the panel and I'll come back to you today. I'll now introduce our presenter for today, Linda Arrowsmith. If you've attended some of our webinars in the past, you'll know Linda well. She worked in HR for over 18 years. Of course, she's CIPD qualified and she's our HR advice line team leader at MorePay. Good morning, Linda. I'll now hand over to yourself to take everyone through today's session, Employment Law Changes in 2022.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for attending today. I'm just going to give some high-level information about things that are expected to come in the next 12 months. So starting with a big topic currently, given we've all been working from home and some of us are back working from home, which is making flexible working the default. So what the government intend, if we just move on to the next slide, what the government intend is to potentially make it a day one, right? But currently, you know, we need to understand what is flexible working, and what we consider it as is a way of working that suits employees' needs. So that could be having flexible start times, finish times, working from home. Now, all people don't realize this, but all employees can apply for flexible working. You know, currently anyone can apply for flexible working. It isn't just about being a parent or a carer. It can be because you like to play golf on a Friday afternoon. Anyone can apply for flexible working. Although currently the employees must have worked for the same employer for 26 weeks to be allowed to make that request. And any changes that we make as part of a request as an employer are a permanent change to the employee's contract. So this is what currently we do. So the process for doing this currently is to put the request in writing. You can only make one request in 12 months, and then we as employers advisors need to consider the request seriously, and the process must be completed within 3 months. So it's quite a rigid even though it is a relaxed way of addressing flexible working, as opposed to previous regimes, it is still admin heavy and it's quite rigid. And I think what they intend to do is just to make it a bit easier by, if we move on to the next slide, Hannah. Oh, sorry, guys, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So these are just some of the examples of flexible working for those that don't necessarily have it within their workplace. They include part-time working, working from home, so working compressed hours. We see this a lot where people who maybe work 40 hours a week will generally work 40 hours over 4 days rather than 5 to allow for childcare. Job sharing, so maybe people don't really want to work a full-time job, so we split that between 2 or even more people. Having flexi time, so flexible start and finish times around core business hours, and also annualized hours, which is unusual, but it does happen where we say this is the amount of hours we want in a year, and the employee and the employer can agree an appropriate amount of hours to work at certain times of the year. And that's generally good with schools and any kind of academia where you have your busier times and your not so busy times. And the next slide, Hannah, please. Okay, so day one right. So what the government are proposing is that the right to apply for flexible working is going to be a day one right. The government want to, basically what they say is they want to free employers and employees alike from the default 9 to 5 model in order to recruit and retain the talent we need. And these 5 key proposals are making the request for flexible working a day one right, and so whether to retain as well the 8 business reasons for refusing a request, because we as employers, our advisors rely on these 8 business reasons for trying to make our work efficient. So this will be an interesting one to watch, because if they take that away, it'll be interesting to see how they propose we manage these requests. That is going to be an interesting one. What they are proposing to do is require us to suggest alternatives. So maybe if somebody works in maybe a receptionist role and they want to go on flexi hours, so start earlier leave, maybe we offer them an admin as an alternative. That's quite an interesting one, because previously we would just have focused on the actual role that the employee does at that point in time, rather than thinking about something alternative to what they're doing. So that to me actually seems quite logical. Ending the restriction on employees to one flexible working request in 12 months. It just makes things a whole lot easier for employers and employees if things maybe are not working out. And then allowing a request for temporary arrangement. So to say maybe I only want to work flexibly for a period of time for one reason or another. Maybe people, I don't know, in theatre and they take part in a panto, maybe they want to do it for just the winter. It might be a useful thing for employers and employees, maybe if you're quieter at Christmas, to think about. So it isn't necessarily going to be a permanent change to terms and conditions of employment. It could be temporary arrangement. So yeah, some of these are quite interesting, but it'll be interesting to understand how we're going to manage that as employers and advisors. Moving on, Hannah. Okay, so moving on to carers leave. So the government have launched a consultation into carers leave, and in September they published a response, and they want to introduce carers leave as a day one right for employees. Now, unpaid carers leave, maybe it might not be taken by everyone, but it could be really useful for people who need to take emergency time off to care for to their elderly relatives. Now, what they're proposing is this is going to be a potential 5-day entitlement, which can be taken either in a block of a week or in half days, full days, depending on the requirements of the individual. The legislation is is going to be brought forward, I suppose, as soon as maybe things die down with COVID. I think they've got their hands full at the moment, but it is an intention to bring it in. And the reason for this is that, as it says here, around 5 million people in the UK are providing unpaid care by looking after an elderly or disabled family member or a friend. And these people are generally in work. I know lots of people who are carers for their parents and relatives, even though they do work full time. So, yeah, it's for me, it seems to be a good thing that they're bringing in. So, if we move on to the next stage. Okay, so gender pay gap. So basically, this is just more of a reminder that you need to publish your gender pay gap if required data. So they must report the 2021 data, private companies and charities, by the 5th of April next year, and then public sectors must report their 2021 data by the 31st of March. So it's a bit more of a reminder. Although it is interesting to see that actually feedback on this is that there isn't really any progress. So this actual requirement to report for larger organisations doesn't seem to have had any impacts on the actual gender pay gap itself. Just something interesting to note that, maybe they need to think about stronger measures, but I'm sure we'll see more on this in the future, especially when the COVID situation dies down, which hopefully will happen. Okay, so this is going to be a big one, and I think this is going to cause a lot of questions. I think it's probably going to cause more questions than it answers at the moment, because as per Brexit and settled status, we're not quite sure how they intend to bring this in. But what the government are proposing is a professional qualifications bill. That was announced in the Queen's speech in May last year. And what they're looking to do is recognise qualifications from overseas. So things like teaching, medicine, anything that is regulated, to enable us to employ more migrant workers, to fill gaps in the UK. So it will be interesting to see how it unfolds, but I do definitely see this as a good thing for the world of work and for businesses, especially since we've moved out of, because of Brexit and because of the lack of foreign workers now working in the UK. We've got massive gaps that we need filling. So it will be interesting to see what the government do, as part of this to make it easier for employers, or make it more difficult for employers to recruit migrant workers. But yeah, it is something that is hopefully on the cards and will help with recruitment going forward. Okay, so the health and social care levy, this is definitely coming in. It is what it is. So from April 2023, there's going to be a new ring-fenced health and social care levy of 1.25%. So basically, it's an additional tax to help pay for health and social care. The levy is going to apply to also not to people who are working and pay NIC contributions. It's also going to apply to people above state pension age with an income above 9,568, which is interesting because people over a certain age have never had to pay national insurance before. This is an additional levy and it will apply to them. It's going to be administered by the HMRC and it will be collected through the normal process. So your PAYE, or if you put your self-assessments in, it'll be done at that stage. So like national insurance, the contributions are UK wide. So everyone will pay the same: England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And then at the moment, the levy can show as an additional amount, but it doesn't necessarily have to specify what it's going to be. But going forward, it will need to be more specific on your payslip. It will need to show exactly what it is on your payslip. Moving on. So national minimum wage. These are the new rates that are payable from the 1st of April 2022. So apprentices, their current rate is £4.30 per hour. From April 2022, it's going to go up to £4.81. That's 11.9% increase. For 16 to 17-year-olds, it's going from 462 to 481. That's only a 4.1% increase. 18 to 20-year-olds, it's going up from 656 to 683. Again, another 4.1% increase. And actually, I know I'm saying only 4.1%, but it's actually quite a lot compared to what most businesses have been giving as pay rises over the last year and have been able to afford to give, actually. So yeah, I suppose it isn't it's normally would be a huge 4.1% increase, but I suppose when you look at the other increases, they are quite a lot higher. So 21 to 23-year-olds, it's going from 836 to 918. And then the living wage for 23 plus is going from £8.91 to £9.50, which is a 6.6% increase, which is going to have a huge impact on lots of businesses. And then yeah, it is a huge increase for businesses. So yeah, it's worth noting and making plans for getting your payroll systems updated. So COVID vaccinations. Now, I don't know if any of you have missed this in the media or if it's not impacted you at all, but from the 11th of November, all social care workers needed to be double vaccinated. Care providers can assess whether somebody can self-declare that medically exempt. So what this means is that if an employee believes they're medically exempt from having the vaccinations, although they've not got the evidence to prove that, they can self-declare themselves as medically exempt, and that basically that self-declaration has to be in by the 24th of December. So from the 25th of December, if the care workers are unable to be vaccinated, they'll have to use the NHS COVID pass in the same way as the people who are vaccinated to use it. So it's quite a big thing for employers, and we've been managing that through the advice line and seeing lots of dismissals as a result of this, which is unfortunate, but I suppose the idea is to protect the vulnerable. So what we need to think about is how do we manage that from an employee perspective. So care home managers just can't dismiss staff automatically for not having the vaccination. It needs to be considered, it needs to be reasonable, you need to look at other options. So bear in mind that if they're actually physically going into the care home, they still will have to be vaccinated, but maybe they've got a head office that is disconnected to the care home or a separate building. It might be that we can put somebody somewhere else. So all these things have to be taken into account before dismissing. It shouldn't be that you just dismiss off the cuff, especially some of these people have worked in care for many, many years and are now facing a career change because of their beliefs or because of their health. So it's a tricky time. Okay, so again, this has been in the media a lot. So NHS frontline care staff will need to be fully vaccinated from the 1st of April next year. So it's all frontline workers, so be porters, receptionists, anyone working in the NHS. The reason they've put the delay on this as opposed to care homes is that they didn't want people just to leave before the winter months, where we've got flu season and lots of other health conditions that are exacerbated by the cold. So yeah, just a note that there has been some discussion on whether flu jabs should be mandatory, and I think they've decided that it isn't going to be mandatory to take a flu jab, although there is some debate on whether countries should make the COVID vaccine mandatory, which has caused lots of debate, but it's all interesting to see, but we're not sure how it will happen in practice. So yeah, this is going to cause a lot of fallout in the next 4 or so months. So yeah, it's interesting to know what's coming. So bearing all this in mind, what we would advise you do as a company is have a good recording system for people who've had the vaccine and who've not. It's quite easy if you're a small business and you don't have too many staff, but if you're a larger organisation, maybe you use a management system, maybe you have a HR system where we could have a little tick box in there or something. You need to hold regular meetings with employees who've not had the vaccine just to understand why. If people are not medically exempt, then we need to warn the employees that if they don't have the vaccine, they may face dismissal. This is if you are an NHS employer. But private companies are considering making vaccines mandatory as well. And if that's something you want to do, then speak to us about it and we'll support you with a process. We would want to look for alternative non-frontline jobs for those that still have not had the vaccine. If in the NHS, if there are no alternative jobs, then as we have done in lots of care homes, we may need to terminate employment. Consider your plans for those who are medically exempt. I know we've actually seen the CQC tell us that the exemption's not valid, which was interesting. So yeah, just consider what you'll need to do for those who are not medically exempt. And it's really important to note that just because there's been a change in law on the vaccines, employment law hasn't changed, and we still have to follow the same fundamental principles of employment law to ensure a fair and reasonable process and that we're not unreasonably dismissing somebody. And as it says here, dismissals can still be unfair in these circumstances. So over to you, Hannah.
So we've now reached the end of the updates in terms of what's coming in 2022. So I'll just quickly run through a few ways that you can keep up with employment law changes, and then we will move into the Q&A session. So please keep dropping your questions into the panel. So I'm sure you'll all agree that keeping up with regular changes to legislation is hard work. Just when you think you're compliant, there's something new to remember. So if you haven't already, I definitely recommend downloading our bi-monthly employment law guide. It's located in the Knowledge Centre, which is easy to find in the menu on our website. And the guide includes advice on employment law updates as they happen, and it's in a very easy to read PDF format. So do make sure that you download that if you haven't done so already. And on our Knowledge Centre, you'll also find lots of other useful resources relating to employment law changes, webinars that are coming up, and everything that you see is free to download within that section. So we will now move into the Q&A session. I will pull up your questions now. Well, one of the ones that I've seen most, Linda, is people asking around the COVID vaccinations and people asking, are they permitted to ask employees whether they have been vaccinated?
So the answer to me is yes, you can ask somebody if they've been vaccinated. The problem will be is what are you going to do about it if you don't like the response? So yes, you can ask the question. I think it's fundamentally reasonable to ask the question given what's going on in the world. But it's what do we do with it if we don't like the answer? That's where the problem arises.
Thank you, Linda. That's really useful. We've also had a few questions around the carers leave. So one person has asked, with the carers leave, will it not just be for a family member? Could it also be for someone that's potentially looking after one of their friends, looking after one of their neighbours?
Yeah, I think we think of carers as, like you say, you think you care for your children and your parents, but I know people that care for friends, acquaintances even. So I don't think it'll be restricted to just a close family member. I think it will be opened up to just anyone who you do provide care for, you care for, whether that would be a friend or a relative. Yeah, as long as you're the carer, that should be fine. But then that poses a problem about managing that and ensuring that people don't abuse that as well. So it's interesting to see how that will play out and what we'll have to do from an employment law perspective to manage it. So yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Thank you, Linda. We've also had a few questions around the professional qualifications bill, as you imagine that we would. So we've been asked, will it extend to services like law qualifications, HR qualifications?
I really don't know the answer to that question because it's something that's still being debated. I believe that they will look at gaps in business where people are struggling to recruit a certain role and maybe apply that. So, medicine has generally been something that is needed and required, and therefore if people can't recruit enough nurses and doctors, then that gives us the fundamental reason for looking elsewhere. But I don't know whether HR would be as would come under that kind of heading. I think it would maybe solicitors might do. The answer is I don't know. But it will be interesting to see what the government say that we can and can't do on this, and how we're going to manage that as employers and recruiters.
Thank you, Linda. We have also had a few questions about the gender pay gap reporting. So someone's asked, if a company is owned by a larger group, which employee headcount determines if you need to carry out the gender pay gap reporting?
So, sorry, say that again, Hannah.
So this lady's saying that her company is owned by a larger group. So would it be, I guess in our case, for example, would they take the numbers of the number of people that are employed by Morpay or the number of people that are employed by Zelis, being the parent company, for the actual cut-off on the number?
Okay, so you're basically, I believe that it will be, it is just that. If it depends on the separate PAYEs, I believe it's an entity rather than an overriding parent thing. So yeah, I think because it's all about wages, it's about the amount of money that goes through your payroll. But well, yeah, it's so basically. Can I just take that one offline and I'll come back to take the
Yeah,
details of
that's fine.
whoever it
We
is?
can take the details and come back.
It's one of them ones that you don't get very often, and my actual instinct is telling me it's about the entity, because a lot of these things are based on the amount of money that goes through your payroll, and if it's a separate PAYE, then it generally will apply to that PAYE rather than an overriding parent company. But if I can just take that offline, if that's okay.
No problem at all. Again, we have had quite a few more questions flying in about the COVID vaccinations. There's a few around the record keeping and what can and can't be kept in terms of data protection and that kind of thing.
So a lot of this stuff will generally be covered in your contracts of employment. So when you get an employee to sign a contract, you will then make some kind of comment. Well, we do in our documentation that there is a disclaimer on the back of the bottom of the handbook, just to say that this is the kind of data we're going to be holding and this is where it's going to be stored, and it just needs to be used for a reasonable amount of time, and that would generally be covered off in the handbook from a data protection perspective. Now, medical data also needs to be retained for so long as well, so there's a kind of conflicting data protection issues on medical data. Basically, as long as the employees are in agreement that you've got the data, they've signed to agree to give you the data, and they know that you're going to only use it for the reasons as you instruct them that you're getting it for, if you like, and that you tell them how long you're going to keep this data for, it should be absolutely reasonable to log the data. It's all about openness and clarity. And as long as you're not just doing it to point out somebody's not had the vaccine for no good reason, it has to be for a legitimate reason. There has to be a legitimate aim to retaining the data, which I think for me can be justified given the pandemic. And depending on what business you work in and the reason for retaining the data, it could all be justifiable under data protection legislation. But like I say, document, be open and honest and transparent, and be reasonable, and we should be fine.
Thank you, Linda. We'll just go through a couple more of these questions around COVID vaccinations, but I think a lot of it is very much a moving feast at the moment. There's people asking questions around, can we insist that unvaccinated employees take lateral flow tests? There's people asking questions about, can employees refuse to come to the workplace if they're working alongside people that haven't had the vaccination?
The thing is, it would depend on the reason they're given, and so a lot of employment law is all about being reasonable. And if somebody is refusing to come to work because their colleagues are unvaccinated, and they are quoting health and safety legislation, they don't believe that the workplace is a safe place to work, then that is potentially a tricky situation, and from an employment law perspective, difficult to manage. I don't know if some of you dealt with this way back in the beginning before the vaccinations, where people were called back into the office and they didn't want to come because of the health and safety risk of catching COVID. I think we're probably back there again with this, and I think that if people know that colleagues are not vaccinated, then this may come up, and managing it's going to be a case-by-case basis. So what's the reason? Maybe they're particularly vulnerable and they're using a health and safety reason for not coming back to work. Is that reasonable? Potentially. Can we do something about it? Maybe, but then we would have to manage it through a process of putting health and safety things in place to make sure that maybe the person that isn't vaccinated is not in direct contact with the person that isn't. So it depends on the individual circumstances, your workplace, what you can physically put in place. Lateral flow tests, a lot of companies have introduced lateral flow tests over the last 12-18 months, so that if employees are coming into the office, before they come into the office, to take a lateral flow test. And that is fair and reasonable. As long as you consult it in and get agreement, it is perfectly reasonable to expect somebody to take a lateral flow test.
Thank you, Linda. That's all really useful. We've also had a couple more questions around the carers leave. Someone's asked the difference between dependency care and carers leave. They're saying they're both unpaid, so are they quite similar?
So dependency leave is where you need emergency time off to look for a dependent. So, and it is actually, it's set out in law that it is somebody who is dependent on you, which is normally a child or maybe your spouse or your parent. It's generally somebody that is closely related to you, and that they need time off, emergency time off. Maybe you get a phone call from your child's school to say the class has gone down with COVID and you've just got to go and get them, or that is dependency leave. Carers leave is going to be something a bit different. Maybe it's time off for appointments to take somebody who relies on you to hospital, or maybe they're planning to have an operation of some kind, so you're going to know that they're going to need additional support for them a couple of days afterwards, or even time to take them to and from the hospital. It'll be more planned stuff rather than, it could still be emergency stuff, but I think it's more around the planned stuff that's going to go on, that planned stuff that's required for people who are vulnerable, that require care, rather than emergency time off, which is what dependency is all about.
Thank you, Linda. We've also had a few questions around recordings and slides, so we will be sending out a copy of the recording, so you will have that to refer to. We have now reached the end of our Q&A session, so I would like to thank everyone that did ask a question, and also I would like to thank Linda for presenting this morning. I think there's been a lot of useful information that's come out of this, lots of things to look out for within the new year. This is our last webinar of the year. However, we will of course be running lots more webinars in 2022, so please do look out for them. And as I say, I will send you a recording of the presentation this afternoon. So thank you very much for attending, and again thank you to Linda also.
Thanks, guys.
And we will close the webinar off there. Thank you.